Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back and thank you for joining us. My name is Brooks Lindbergh. I am a third-year law student here at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law, and I will be moderating our final panel today, which is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? And I want to start by thanking the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law and the Sports Equity Lab for making this conference and our discussions today possible. Now, as shown vividly throughout our conference today, sexual assault of student athletes across the country is a systemic problem with wide-ranging causes. And because the causes are wide-ranging, our panel today is composed of experts and professionals from various fields and disciplines that each grapple with how to respond to and how to prevent sexual assault of athletes. And our goal in this final panel is to discuss that. Where is it that we should go from here? Now, to achieve this goal, we welcome you, the audience, to submit your questions for our panelists throughout our discussion today. Now, although you won't be able to see which questions have been submitted to us on your end, I, as the moderator, will be able to weave your questions into our discussion today with the panelists as you submit them. So we highly encourage you to be interactive throughout the panel, and you can do so by submitting your questions in that Q&A function in the bottom of your screen. And also just to note, we will be reserving about 20 minutes at the end of our panel today where we will specifically engage and address questions that you might have. And after this panel, Dean Cronk-Warner of the law school is going to wrap up our conference by giving some closing remarks. And with that, I am eager to introduce our panel to you. With us today is Austin Meek. Austin is a staff writer at The Athletic. Austin covers Michigan football, and his article, Take Care of Bo's Team, was included in The Athletic's Best of 2020. In that article, Austin investigates what Coach Bo Schembechler and others at the University of Michigan knew about Dr. Robert Anderson's alleged abuse of hundreds of Michigan athletes. And by doing so, Austin also investigates the questions haunting the survivors of Dr. Anderson's sexual abuse. Also with us today is Dr. Yetsa Tuakli. She is an assistant clinical professor at Yale University and a board-certified physiatrist. She's also an athlete herself. And while specializing in interventional spine and sports medicine treatments, Dr. Yetsa Tuakli also directs the Sports Equity Lab, whose mission is to reduce inequities in sport, such as abuse, while at the same time using sport to reduce inequalities in society, such as social exclusion. Also with us today is Lauren Allswede. She is a licensed master social worker and the co-founder of North Star Wellness Center in Lansing, Michigan. Lauren has worked in the field of trauma since 2003, and in addition to providing counseling services, Lauren also provides training and consultation to local organizations on topics including sexual harassment, implicit bias, crisis response, and cultural inclusivity. And also rounding out the last of our panel today is Mark Harlan. Mark is the athletics director here at the University of Utah. And before becoming the athletics director here in 2018, Mark was the athletics director at the University of South Florida for 4 years. And so overall, Mark is a veteran administrator with over 20 years of intercollegiate athletics experience. And I know I not only speak for myself, but on behalf of the audience when I say thank you to all our panelists today for coming and volunteering your time and being willing to engage in this important discussion. And I guess just to start, in preparation for our meeting today, I gave a lot of thought about maybe where the best place to start a discussion would be. And given our prompt asking where it is that we go from here, I thought it might be helpful to know and get a sense from each of you where it is that you think we actually are at right now. And so to kind of begin this discussion, I thought it would be helpful kind of get from each of you if over the past 5 or 10 years, you've noticed any developments in terms of how it is that we are responding or trying to adapt or come up with ways to prevent sexual assault of student athletes and those that enable it. And I think maybe start discussion, Mark. I'm very curious, you as an athletics director, whether you've noticed any trends or developments in the last 5-10 years with other athletics directors or coaches, throughout the country, and how it is that we can go about preventing sexual assault on student athletes.
Thank you, Brooks. Thank you for inviting me here to this, incredibly important topic. So I'm honored to be here with these panelists who I'm looking forward to listening as well today to everyone. But, when I think of this subject, I think of the intentionality, so to speak, that I have approached this, particularly in the last, as you said, 5 to 10 years. We all read the horror stories from across the country and try to learn from them. And I know that my time at UCLA and then when I became an athletic director, it's something I've always been very much focused on. And so specifically, I think when we look at the environment that these young people come into and the mindset that they have to compete and graduate and that tunnel vision that can develop, one of the things that my team really work hard on is how do we crack through the tunnel vision? And when I say tunnel vision, I mean, being aware of not only themselves and their surroundings, but also being aware of their teammates and what might be going on with them. And of course, the most important thing is feeling comfortable to come forward that. And that's where I come in, right? Having the kind of environment set up that it is comfortable to come forward, whoever that may be, and wherever they might be in that organization. So I think there's been some very intentional work in that. I can speak to different, required trainings from the NCAA, and I appreciate those. But I've come down to the point where it's the environment that you create and the comfortability that you have to have. Last thing we'll say is we've been so intentional on investing in our mental health programs. At University of Utah, we have 5 full-time psychologists here, and that is a critical piece. And 5 years ago, that didn't exist in athletic departments. Nothing against our great mental health professionals on Central Campus, but having those here also helps with managing and seeing things that we might not otherwise have seen. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's a priority for us here, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but I believe our industry has come around to realize this is a significant issue, and it's upon all of us to make things better.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and also kind of staying in the same theme of where we think things are at currently. I'm also very interested with you, Dr. Yetsa Tuakli. I mean, as practicing sports medicine, I feel like you're also equally very close to this actual issue. And I don't know if on your end, if you've noticed kind of any developments or trends in how it is that those practicing in sports medicine are responding to this problem.
Yeah, thanks, Brooks. So yeah, I just wanted to echo what Mark said, thanking everybody for the opportunity to be here and to participate as a lab. I've heard it said that we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth and we should use them in that proportion. So just listening has been a huge and great honor throughout the entire conference. And so I'm going to try to weave in some of the themes that I've heard in what I say. So in sports medicine, we've actually done a pretty good job, I think, over the past 5 to 8 years of incorporating some very important themes into our clinical practice. Sidebar, sports medicine, when it's done well, can actually be a really beautiful and wonderful safety net setting for athletes and all in the sports environment where meaningful and beautiful shared experiences are created with trust. So we've seen it done poorly with Doctors Nassar and Anderson. And some of us, like me and my colleagues, are trying to do it differently. The one caveat that makes it a little bit challenging for us to weave some of these themes in is that sports, kind of like sports medicine, really likes this sort of neat, simple, and for the most part, binary things, right? There's a win-loss record. There's a teammate, there's an opponent. There's a broken bone, there's an intact bone, right? But we're talking about human beings here, and more specifically, their decisions and their behaviors, both of which are made up of a lifetime of experiences from childhood to adulthood that are constantly being changed as our lives unfold. So it's a messy business with an emotional valence and a departure from that simplistic, binary, sterile way of thinking and a move towards nuanced, but well-studied understandings of human behavior is required. So I'm really happy to report that although sports medicine is a little bit slow on the uptake, more and more general clinical environments like pediatric environments that may serve athletes or internal medicine environments that may serve athletes are moving towards an integrative model of healthcare where trauma-informed approaches are taken really seriously. And we all understand that trauma has reverberating impacts. Again, to be sure, sports medicine itself, I think, is a little bit slow on the uptake, but late great scholar Celia Brackenridge in 1999 laid a beautiful foundation for us. She and co-author Rod Jacques described specifically how sports medicine physicians could fold abuse prevention into our therapy and into our work. More recently, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine put out a comprehensive position statement on this topic last year. Dr. John Finoff, he's formerly at the Mayo Clinic, is now the Chief Medical Officer of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. He prioritized trauma this year during his tenure. And some of us have started to think very carefully about how we can incorporate the adverse childhood experiences framework into our day-to-day clinical practice. So it's important. We're a little slower than other clinical specialties like pediatrics and internal medicine, but we're definitely getting there in sports medicine. I just want to finally say that on the research side of things, the National Collegiate Athletic Association is doing a pretty good job of prioritizing well-being, mental health, and overall athlete holistic care in some of their research projects. I got off a call a couple of days ago with a brilliant group down at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, who is partnering with the NCAA to do some of this research with very rigorous science. So both on the clinical side and on the research side, we're finally folding some trauma-informed themes and principles into our practice, not just in terms of seeing patients, but also studying them. Yeah, so we're getting there.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think you provide a nice kind of transition because, Lauren, I know your expertise and specialization involves a lot of trauma-informed counseling and care. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts too, in terms of, again, looking at the last 5 to 10 years, if you think there have been good developments in how it is we treat trauma and deal with these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to echo everybody else, just want to acknowledge the appreciation for all the survivors who've shared their stories with us. I think it's a reminder of how much strength it takes to be so vulnerable, and a reminder for all of us too to be good stewards to that vulnerability and their experiences, and beyond listening, and of course needing to listen and using our ears and everything, and then the action that we take. And so in the past couple of years, and some of the things that have changed, I've noticed, is that there is a lot more understanding about what trauma actually is, like who survivors are and who perpetrators are. And with that knowledge, with that understanding, that helps reshape some of the script, because we've had kind of the stereotypical myth about who survivors are, and perpetrators are big, bad, ugly guys that, are gnarly, and we can identify them really quickly. When they're esteemed doctors and they hide in institutions and are enabled, then we have a much clearer picture of who to protect and who to identify to as enablers. And I'm really excited about this book that Amos is doing, because I think we need to know much more about enablers. I think this is part of where we need to go next, is finding out more about who are enablers so we can better protect people and create change in institutions too.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then again, I think you provide a great transition to go to Austin. I'm fascinated by your work because, at least on my end, as just a normal, ordinary guy, I feel like the only way that I learn about new issues or new things that are being done or scandals that have happened is through reading the news and through journalism. And I'm interested if, in your experience, where you've reported and investigated sexual assault at universities, if you think that how those stories are currently reported, or the process of kind of like investigating those has changed over the last couple of years, and maybe to kind of transition into a new focus in the discussion, if you think there are any things that we should maybe be doing to change how we investigate and report those issues.
Yeah, first of all, I would echo the comments of the other panelists. I'm grateful to be invited today and grateful to be sharing the screen with my fellow panelists. Just as background, so several months ago, I had the opportunity to interview John Vaughn, the keynote speaker today, as well as some other former University of Michigan athletes who were abused by Dr. Robert Anderson. And as a sports journalist, that story gave me an opportunity to think more deeply about a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, and especially the issue that you raised in terms of how we as journalists tell these stories, because I'm certainly not clinically trained on a lot of these issues. I spend a lot of my time in the press box or on a press row, but I do feel a great responsibility to tell these stories in a responsible way and honor the trust that the survivors place in us as journalists to present their stories to the world. So if you look back at sports journalism over the years, I think you will find many, many stories that have been written about these great larger than life figures in college sports, great coaches like Joe Paterno, Bear Bryant, and certainly Bo Schembechler at the University of Michigan, and with good reason. There are coaches who have experienced tremendous success and had a positive impact on countless athletes that have been part of their programs. And I think even the athletes that I spoke to for the story who competed for Bo Schembechler at Michigan, despite the abuse that happened to them, they still have an admiration for their coach and for a lot of the values that they learned from their coach. But at the same time, I think we can see how we in the media have contributed in a way to sort of building these myths around these great, powerful coaches who became really all powerful figures at their universities. And you can see this imbalance in power that developed, where you have an athlete like John Vaughn or an athlete like Chuck Christian, who grew up in a poor family in Detroit and had an opportunity on a football scholarship to play at the University of Michigan, which was a life-changing opportunity. And sometimes there's this perception that, if you're an athlete, you should just be grateful to be there. This is your one shot. This opportunity to play for this great coach in Bo Schembechler. And so maybe there's a pressure not to speak up if something happens to you, or a feeling that if you did speak up, well, who's going to listen to you? Because, you're just an athlete, and, here's this all powerful institution or this all powerful coach, and it would be your word against theirs, and nobody would believe you. So I think for us as journalists, there is an obligation to really think about that power imbalance, and think about how can we tell these stories and really put the experiences of the survivors front and center.
Yeah, and that's definitely, throughout this whole conference today, that power imbalance has been a real key theme, and it's been interesting to kind of hear different proposals throughout the conference. And one I'd be interested in any of your thoughts really is the idea that whether student athletes right now are informed enough about their rights or about what even sexual assault might be, or different recourses for them to pursue. I'd be curious on your end if you think there is enough information available to athletes about that, or if there's other types of rights you think that we should maybe be, or resources we should be giving them to help kind of counteract that balance, that power imbalance.
Well, and I want to jump in and say how much I appreciate John coming forward, because he gives them a model for people who have experienced abuse already. He's representing this, and it's okay to come forward and disclose assault. You can have been raped and still be a strong athlete, skilled athlete, excellent student. These aren't counter images. And so to have John come forward and say it's okay allows other people to come forward and talk about their own experiences. It creates different dialogue and education about what rape is, what rights are, what consent and healthy relationships are in general, like a broader conversation beyond the typical good touch, bad touch, but just relationships in general. And when the pressure to play that Austin talked about too, that's a really hard thing to do, to talk about rights when they're in a lot of times in a really confined and restricted environment where they don't have a lot of rights and freedom. And, there's pressure to play, there's pressure, to be the Michigan man. I know I'm probably not getting that phrase right, but above all else, you have to represent the university. And so how to represent the university and play your sport, and then also protect the individual. the pressure to play, I think also the pressure to heal too, for those who have experienced trauma, how to balance healing while still being a student athlete. It's really hard to heal if we're using the armies and the war metaphor. It's hard to heal on the battlefield, especially when shots are still coming at you. So the pressure and the expectations for people who have experienced trauma, or it's in the campus culture, to heal on the battlefield, that's really hard to do. So we need more education too about resources and options for healing in more integrated ways without bullets still flying at people.
I'm not sure if, oh, I was going to say, yeah, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, just that's a very good question, Brooks. Just to sort of reframe the question, actually, because one of the things that I've found is that in a lot of the systems of sport safeguarding, the onus is unfairly placed on athletes' shoulders. Okay, athletes are fundamentally the most vulnerable members of the sport community and society. How is that? They're the ones on whom their bodies have necessarily been commodified for other people's gains, whether it's the school or the team or the coach or their nation at times. And they themselves are oftentimes the least powerful within the sports system. So I think asking for another sort of responsibility to be placed on the athlete's shoulders is actually not the right question. Harlan posed it perfectly. He said he's trying to build environments that permit and enable transparency, communication, honesty, and a higher standard of behavior. So I'd actually just reframe the question. I don't think it's a question of how can we train up more athletes to better defend their rights, to do yet another thing in the environment in which they are the least powerful and the most vulnerable. Rather, it's about creating an environment where there's a permissiveness for transparency, honesty, and openness of communication at the lowest level of harm all the way up to the highest level of harm. So I think that's the better frame for that question. But then just to also just put a pin on one more aspect of this, systems of privilege and power, whether it's a race-based system or a socioeconomic system, those are structural fixed elements of environment, whether it's any social cultural environment, sports environment, a church, a country, a war-torn space, a region, anything. And I think that if we understand that these systems of privilege and power are not necessarily things that you can just train somebody to fight against and it's going to be fixed. That's not the solution. Those fixed structural sort of elements that disadvantage one group, in this case, athletes, below everybody else, are what needs to be fixed, not the athletes knowing more about how to better defend them. I just want to reframe that and just also sort of give us a little shout out to my co-panelist, Mark, for mentioning that his intention is to but set the environment such that a higher standard of behavior is more likely and that base level of behavior is less likely. So that's just my contribution.
I really appreciate that. And it reminds me of a thought process that I came across a few years ago where we were being so deliberate in confidential reporting and real recruit, which allows them to come forward, and them being the student athlete and all the path that they had to do, that they have to do. And that's important. I mean, we're not minimizing that, but there was a period of time and I realized, boy, it is more and more on them. And so what are we doing, again, back to the culture of the folks in power, starting with myself and others that are around them, what's our awareness level and those kind of things, but how are we creating the environment? Otherwise, all those things that were mentioned earlier don't really matter because, it's really not confidential, or, it's going to lead back to my position coach, what have you. And so I think I appreciate that point, because I think it was something I came across personally in my journey with all of this, that all of that doesn't matter if the young person enters in this environment, this department, that department, Olympic, whatever it might be, if you don't have that trust. But I tell you, it's taken a lot of conversations. I mean, boy, the conversations that we have with our student athletes about feeling comfortable to have these conversations. And like I said, it's a journey for them, but you have to water this every single day. You really, really do. And, proud of what we have here, but I tell you, if I don't water it tomorrow, then we've taken a step back. And I think that's what's really, really important. But I appreciate that point. Too much time, I think, as directors of athletics over the last few years have been about them. The focus I'm having now is what are we doing as a staff and coach? And I think that that's really where true progress will be made in this space.
And I really appreciate you reframing that question. I mean, just for me, it felt like a sunburst going off in my head, how you rephrased that and described it. And maybe going to that point, in terms of altering the current environment into something better and not putting that burden as much on students to kind of like know their rights and fix these issues from their end. Do you think there are any current roadblocks or certain things that are proving to be barriers from different departments kind of changing and altering these environments on their end rather than asking that of the students? Yeah. Or I guess, go for it.
Brooks, I was smiling and nodding vigorously because there are so many. There are so many. And I really appreciated what Mark said, because what he mentioned was watering soil. And so the analogy I like, when you read about trauma-informed organizations, what they say is you can train staff all day, every day about how to recognize and treat trauma. But unless you change the actual organizational culture with the beliefs, it's like scattering seed on dry ground. So it's that same analogy of like watering ground. There are many roadblocks, Brooks, and I've actually, in preparation for this, I wanted to highlight just 4 of them. The first I just wanted to share from the sports medicine side of things is that getting clinicians who have trained for decades and decades, very proud of their training and have all their degrees and gold-plated frames on their walls, to start to truly believe that the behavioral sciences need to be centered in this conversation is really hard. It's really hard. People are very defensive about their training and what they know, starting to say that, hey, behavioral science and integrative health and holistic approaches are what need to be centered, because we're talking about human behavior. It's hard. People have a very difficult time sort of changing their lens and really prioritizing a different way of thinking about human behavior, individual and group behavior. So that's the first thing. Second, I would say is that we've still miss the boat when it comes to intersectionality. And I was amazed by Jonathan Vaughn's speech this morning, because he really shared clearly how what an athlete brings to the table matters in a few very fundamental ways. Okay, first, because what's allowed and accepted in one cultural setting may not be allowed and accepted and experienced in another cultural setting. So not all of us have seen violence in our homes. Not all of us have seen neglect and abuse and household dysfunction. And so we all come to the table with something totally different. And that intersectionality, meaning an athlete or a person's layers of identity and experiences, it's brought to bear in these conversations on abuse in sport. The second way that it comes up, intersectionality that is that because abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction change the way you fundamentally see the world. So a history of adversity exposure can influence an athlete's vulnerability to certain types of harm, again, because some of that adversity might be normalized in their mindset and in their experience. So the relationship between childhood adversity and adversity in sport is something we've incompletely understood, I could say, and we haven't woven it into our practice quite yet. So miss the boat on intersectionality. We need to start incorporating what athletes are bringing to the table as we're describing and thinking about how they're experiencing harm in their sports environments. Third, in sport, I think it's really difficult to turn conflicts of interest into common interests. And I put it that way because, in my view, as a sports medicine physician, I can tell you, I understand the neurobiology of trauma. I know that a traumatized brain with that tunnel vision and that heightened stress response, it's great in the sports field, but it's not great when you want an athlete to tell you what's going on outside of the sports setting, maybe if they're being abused. And I know it affects performance. As we heard from Sarah Klein, it affects daily life. It affects your mood state. Literally, trauma itself and the flip side of that is athlete well-being is directly connected to performance in life, in sport, in school. So trying to get those interests to be common, to let people know that, hey, we all have the same common interests. These are not conflicts of interests. Well-being and health and holistic care of athletes will lead to better performances on all fronts is a challenge. That's a barrier I find. People have a hard time for some reason joining up those dots. And then the fourth thing, as I mentioned before, is that there really is an over-reliance on reporting. I think that's a barrier because, again, it places the burden unfairly on athletes' shoulders. I think these punishment paradigms, Amos and I, we butt heads on this all the time because I'm not a lawyer. I'm a healer. And so I'm very interested in nurturing people back to wellness. And I have the sense that punishment paradigms focused entirely on sanctions and reporting, I really think that doesn't really change culture. Okay, it temporarily engenders fear and edits people's behavior, but it doesn't engender honesty and openness and sort of communication channels that are clear. And I think sports settings have a really incomplete understanding of how to develop these permissive environments that encourage the open and transparent sharing of concerns, low-level concerns, high-level concerns, all concerns, which make up sort of the brass tacks of this thing called abuse in sport. So that's the fourth barrier I see, just really trying to embed positive reinforcement nurture into the punishment paradigm over reliance of reporting that a lot of safeguarding systems lean to and lean in the direction of.
I appreciate your feedback there. And one thing, that is not something I thought about personally when you're mentioning that fourth factor of the over-reliance on reporting. I guess when, personally, that idea of having open communication, I guess directly having an environment where that's possible, I do think that sounds preferable. And I don't know if on your end there's any types of behaviors or institutional changes you think that specifically could be made to maybe help further develop that direct communication about the issues. If anybody wants to jump in on that, that is. But.
I want to speak to creating a culture of wellness and healing and making it safe for people to come forward, not penalizing people for coming forward. It's not a challenge of the institution, or, you know, it should be safe in a culture to challenge systems that aren't safe. And also having accountability. So there were lots of incidents with Dr. Anderson, Robert Anderson, and Larry Nassar. And so if there's safety for people to come forward and talk and challenge, there needs to also be accountability when there is behavior that is harmful, abusive, reported, you know, when that needs to be addressed and handled. You know, there has to also be protection of people who have reported. There has to be some kind of sanction in order to have a healing environment at the same time.
Oh yeah, I think it's not a either or, it's a both and.
Right, accountability, safety, healing, and then whatever kind of sanction so that people know it's serious, it's responded to, because people can say we care, you know, they can have the teal ribbon and the purple ribbon on, and then not fire the person who has been abusive for years, or, you know, we can say we care, but it has to be followed up by actions. It has to be institutionalized in the infrastructure and the culture. It has to be safe for people to come forward. A lot of times people come forward and they're the ones who are penalized. They're the ones who are sanctioned.
I think one of the things that Amos brought to the forefront in his book is that when you look at the different cases that have occurred, whether it's at Penn State or Ohio State or Michigan or even in the Catholic Church, that when you have an organizational structure and culture that is very much a top-down, authority-driven culture where there's this sense of what happens inside these walls stays inside these walls, and you don't speak to anybody outside the room about what happens to you here, that does create the potential for abuse. And I know as a journalist, I've been in situations interviewing athletes where I could tell that there was, a really strong taboo about speaking about, things, that may have happened within the team. And to some extent, I think that, that absolutely is necessary. There are certain things that athletes shouldn't share with the media. And there is certainly a fine balance between, respecting very legitimate privacy concerns and also having a culture of openness where, athletes feel empowered, to speak if they need to speak to somebody beyond just the people inside their organization, that they feel empowered to do that. So I think the common thread in a lot of these cases is with big organizations and institutions, often there is, within the institution, the reputation of the institution is placed above the interest of the people within the institution. So the more that we can break down that barrier and create openness and empower athletes to speak to people who might not be the people just inside the walls of their locker room, I think that will help us make progress.
Yeah, Austin, I would totally agree with that. And I'm glad that you mentioned the win at all costs sort of high-powered milieu that sports really is. The sports setting is a unique setting, but it has similarities to other sociocultural settings like a family home, an educational classroom, a learning classroom, and the military. It's got very, very similar. I mean, a lot of athletes will say, you know, their team is sort of like their team is sort of like an army, right? Especially sort of in the hyper-masculine sports like football or rugby. And you've got your general who might be your coach, and you've got your teammates who are sort of on the front lines with you, sometimes literally a line. And so I think the interesting thing is if we can look in organizational psychology, Brooks, you asked the question about how can these things actually practically be done. We can look at organizational psychology studies, and there have been studies in the military. There have been studies in educational settings, for example, colleges and universities, studies in industrial sectors like the restaurant industry, where a positive reinforcement approach, where you articulate what the positive behaviors are, give people an opportunity to excel in those positive behaviors, measure those behaviors, and then feedback to those who are being measured or analyzed or assessed when they've done well, sort of like leading people with carrots, not with sticks. It's been shown year over year, season over season, decade over decade, to slowly but surely start to shift that Titanic of organizational culture. So we can look to other settings. We don't have to just say sort of this myopic sports view and say, hey, how have other organizations with lots of people from diverse backgrounds working together towards a common goal, how have they done it? How have they positively improved their culture and elevated their standards of behavior in a measurable way? And so I really like what Lauren said about the fact that on the punishment side of things, there are great sort of threads of accountability. We have teeth to all the sort of punishment and sanction safe sport efforts. We don't have teeth on the positive reinforcement side. We don't have checklists that can be used to measure good behavior. We haven't even articulated the good behavior, where other industries have. So my suggestion would be to look to organizational psychologists' scholarship and their really kind of like decades long science and say, hey, what can we learn in sport from these spaces? And how can we start to measure, being, you know, we all treasure what we measure, as the marketing people would say. We can measure the good stuff and give gold stars for things that are articulated. I think that's one way to do it.
I think that's an interesting, I guess, dilemma like you're raising with punishment. It seems there's very clear repercussions. There's very clear rules that can be violated. But when you're talking about how can you incentivize good behaviors, I mean, for me, it seems like the big thing typically is bigger profits. And that's a hard kind of carrot to give them. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a nebulous question, but I'd be interested in, from you, Mark, if there are things on your end that you think might incentivize different programs or things that might be more encouraging rather than just, you know, getting hit with bad rules and stuff.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thought when you think of it, incentivizing in this space when it's just the right thing to do in its simplest of forms. And so I probably would need to give more thought on that. I do, and it's very intriguing, and I will. It's holding people accountable in the ways that you expect them to be. In other words, let me give you an example. In our compliance, NCAA compliance here, one of the things that's viewed as a success on the end of a given year is how many quote unquote self-reports you might have. And the reason why that's a success is because you're coming forward and you're saying, I made a mistake in this, I got foul of the rule book, and those are what's called level 3s, and you learn from them and you move on. What I'm starting to track in my team is, as I look across and evaluate the programs, is where is the interaction, for example, with the OEO office? What's the outreach with the various training mechanisms? And I could go on in other metrics that I look in that are well beyond the sport, but the engagement of them being a full student for the full experience, which I'm really big on here, but also just, engaging with some of the folks that are embedded here. We have many folks that are now embedded. I think in our conference in the Pac-12, we've really led in that space of having people that are around the program outside of coaches. Omnibus, yes, but also people that are trained to see things better than say a coach or an athletic director. So the point of that is really looking at our programs. You can see pretty quickly who's better in that space and who's not. And so when I think of incentivizing, to your point, I probably get mad at those that don't. And I spend more time on those rather than really thinking about those that really have engaged and brought in everything from incredible speakers like some of these folks here that we're listening to and others. But it is an interesting thing. I think that holding accountable on the full, calendar year of different type of engagement. But of course, I certainly can without, breaking any confidentiality, can think of students that have gone through this journey as I've been an athletic director in 2 schools and learning from their journeys. And frankly, in some cases, more years ago, that journey is hard, as Lauren mentioned, and how we're taking care of those people. I'm interested from the panelists too. It still comes up, you're doing everything right, but that young person, I just don't want that person to be held accountable because the team dynamics and, or I don't want to do this. I mean, it's amazing. It still happens. And then again, that's incumbent on myself as a leader. Our incredibly trained, as Austin said, he's a trained reporter. He's not a trained clinical psychologist, and neither am I. Bringing in those people to work through those objections that are still there. They're like that in the Army. They're like that in outside life, but they're certainly here. So how we continue to make sure that those folks are taken care of, because I tell you what I really thought is when those people come forward, there's 20 others that know what happened to them. And there's 20 others watching what is happening to he or she as she makes that journey. And any missteps along that way by the Department of Athletics, the university, what have you, is going to cause those 20 people to run and cover. And we've now we've multiplied a tragedy. So we take it very seriously to track that too.
And I think what Amos talks about, what John shares, Tiffany, Sarah, is beyond rape itself, the things that are traumatizing too are everything that happens next. And so rape is traumatic as it is, and the need to heal from that, but then there's the need to heal from the institution that betrayed you and the friends that betrayed you and the system that let you down, and people say report and you report, nothing happens. And there's so much trauma that happens after the initial trauma. So really needing to address beyond the reporting part of it, what happens next? Who's supporting people? If we're talking about incentivizing, because I've learned over this time too, you can't make people do the right thing. You can't legislate good behavior, or sue for good behavior. It's a lot of people don't do the right thing because they have other motives. And I left Michigan State University. I thought for a while that the system was broken. And then I realized, no, the system was working for MSU. It was not broken for them. So I kept trying to, fix something and change something. This isn't working. People are traumatized. They can't get help. And we can make these changes. And then I left when I realized to MSU, the system was not broken. The system was working just fine. They were profiting just fine. They had different goals. So thinking about what we can do at universities to change that culture, to incentivize and celebrate people coming forward or helping a friend who has been assaulted, or, making the culture respond to good behavior and making that from top down, because so much of it is top down. The transparency, the actions, the behaviors, whatever is put out publicly for people has to be like tenfold on the inside without any other kind of public recognition. It has to be actually in the framework, not just what's reported to the news that they're doing and how they care.
Yeah, Lauren, and I'm glad you mentioned that top-down nature of sport. It's sort of like the idea that has been talked about time and time again about the power imbalance that sits there. I don't know the answer to the question that Mark posed, but a suggestion for trying to get to the answer is to make sure that when we're designing these policies, programs, and procedures, and when we're making decisions at tables, maybe they're in boardrooms or whatever, that we have athletes at the table, particularly athletes with lived experience of abuse and harm, who are at a point emotionally and also developmentally where they are stable and happy to, number one, contribute, as Sarah mentioned, contribute the experiences they've had to the co-development of some of these policies, programs, and procedures. Because so many times in sport, particularly at the International Olympic, Paralympic, and so the International Federation level, we have boardrooms and decision-making tables that are completely disconnected from the athlete's experience. And part of that is simply because a chair hasn't been made available for an athlete to sit there and help co-develop, co-design these policies, programs, and procedures. I think that in any sector, people with lived experience of the thing that we're studying and talking about are uniquely suited to critically appraise that thing. Those things that are so obvious to John and to Tiffany and to Sarah and to me and to all of us with lived experience of abuse in sport are not obvious to those without that. And so we kind of you can cut corners essentially by opening a chair up or two or three for those athletes with lived experience of the thing that we're talking about. So that's one suggestion for how to get closer to the answer to the question that is layered and complicated question, but because it's asking to go against the culture of sport, to go against any culture is hard to do, but that's one suggestion I would have. So I think having a joined up approach where the athlete's voices is intentionally integrated and centered would be useful in trying to get to the bottom of those dilemmas.
Yeah, I think there's a broader conversation happening right now in terms of student athlete rights and student athlete empowerment in college sports. It's partly an economic conversation with some of the name, image, likeness conversation that's happening right now. And I think sometimes some of the other inequalities that we talk about can be expressed as financial inequalities too. But I think the broader point is, as you mentioned, making sure athletes have a seat at the table. And in the time that I've been covering college sports, I have seen progress in that. I've seen college athletes have a much bigger voice than they used to have in issues that affect them. But I also think that there's still room for that voice to become bigger and for the structure of college athletics to make more room for the athletes to have an even bigger voice. And I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. If it's some type of collective bargaining right or some type of players association that would allow athletes to really work collectively on their own interests, which sometimes align with the interests of the institution and sometimes don't. So those are really complicated conversations. But I think the more that we move to college athletes having a bigger seat at the table and having a bigger voice on issues that affect them, the better off we're going to be.
Can't echo that enough. Again, I feel like I'm bragging on the Pac-12 here, and I don't mean to. It's not a commercial, but 5 years ago, they made a decision and remain the only Power 5 conference that actually has student athletes, not just in wonderful SAC committees, which is common, but they're actually in the room where it happens in our council meetings and in governance. And the outcomes of that are really starting to see, particularly as it relates to student athlete welfare measures that maybe a 50-year-old white guy thought was good, but you know what, we were off. And I think that was really important to have their voice in there. And as you said, Austin, I'm taking notes here. We have them involved at Utah and other places about name, image, and likeness and the changes in amateurism changing. I don't have them in right now when we're talking about this topic. And it's a great suggestion to riddles that I have in my head. And they're hard conversations, but I think they're ready to have them. I think everybody wants to do that, but that's a really good point. We need to broaden their voice in the comfortability and the culture that I spoke of earlier. Otherwise, how do we know we're doing it right?
I thank you all for that. And I do want to start weaving in, we've received a few questions from the audience. And for the most part, it looks like these questions are just addressed to everyone generally. But one of the first ones we received here comes from an attorney, does not have a social psychologist background, but they are wondering if there's anything they should keep in mind if an athlete reaches out to them about a sexual assault so that they do not contribute to any trauma themselves. Maybe I was gonna say, if maybe Lauren, you can speak more to that.
And we were right on the same wavelength, so I was unmuting. I think some basic training in how to talk to someone in crisis, someone who's been abused. There's just some 101 kind of stuff that people can educate themselves about how to be supportive, how to listen, how to respond, how to believe, how to take things seriously. Questions maybe to like avoid, and depending on what somebody is pursuing legally, or if someone approaches a doctor or a teacher or a coach, or how to respond when somebody comes forward with a disclosure. We all need better skills in that, because that's a critical moment. So some basic listening, supportive listening, and taking some time maybe. I know organizations like mine or other places are very happy to provide training education for people, because it can be very difficult. You can have skills, but needing to practice them, or talk about different scenarios or what to say to be helpful is a skill that's needed, but there are resources available to help people talk about that. And just getting comfortable with this dialogue in general. Like, we just need to talk about sexual assault and trauma and rape. We need to be comfortable having this dialogue. And from a young age, I know earlier on in the day, there was some discussion about just culturally, talking to our kids about their bodies and using appropriate names for things, and talking about subjects that might be uncomfortable, but are critical to talk about. We just need to become more familiar in general with having difficult conversations.
Another question we've received here, and I think Mark, Austin, Yetsa, you can all speak to this, but it starts with an observation here, but they say, we see how even in the national sports culture, there seems to be a pervasive belief that privacy and personal well-being for athletes ranks much lower than profits. They list a bunch of different examples, but their question is, these certainly can have mental health implications and can lead to vulnerabilities. How much of these issues do you see permeating into collegiate athletics?
Trying to process that one too.
Right.
Maybe a translation of that a little bit more.
Sure. So, I mean, from my understanding of the question seems to be, if in your opinion, I guess, if privacy and personal well-being for athletes ranks too low from institutions, if they put too much of a value on profits rather than on the students' well-being, if there's too much of an imbalance there still.
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly think, the pressure on a student athlete comes in many forms, whether it's privacy issues that were alluded to in your question, or uncomfortability of a $91 million budget, which is what we have here at the University of Utah. But I think their pressures come in various different forms, and where they're coming from, what they're dealing with, and all I can say to that, it gets back to what we talked about earlier, is what we're doing as an industry to try to assist with those pressures. I mean, we have pressures of kids that are coming here with the dreams and aspirations that are well beyond theirs. They're coming in from a community perhaps, or a family perhaps, and all those things. So we've, again, tried to be very deliberate in building like our incredible athletic trainers and doctors, we've now built an incredible mental health team that is incredible. And it's not visualizing winning, I can promise you that. It's real stuff. And we're investing in that, and I'm proud of our industry that we've gone that direction. And we talk all the time. You have a broken bone. What do? You go see the trainer and the doctor. So what do you do if you can't get out of bed and you're seeing signs of depression, or you're all the things that we're getting better at understanding and learning to build up those areas. So pressures for them come in many different areas. I think it's our obligation to make sure that they have outlets to go to. And again, continuing to advance in that and never rest on what you've already created.
Yeah, I think.
Go for it. Sorry.
No. I was just going to say that I think it's really an excellent question from the audience member. I think that if you take a look at some of the scholarship that studies specifically human rights and child or youth sports and the connection with those two, you can see very clearly that there are huge dangers to disconnecting an athlete's well-being and athlete's health and athletes thriving as a person, just as a human being outside of his or her performance and profits. I think it's kind of, I'm from Ghana, West Africa, and we don't have the collegiate sports system that exists here. And even when I hear the word, that sort of figure, 91 million, that's like an enormous amount of money. I just can't, this like unfathomable to collegiate sports systems outside of this country. So I think the setup is a challenge first and foremost, because profits are not small. We're not talking about a few dimes and nickels here. It's huge. They're huge financial incentives around performance. And so I can see how the system might set up a natural disconnect between an athlete's humanity, personhood, and well-being and his or her performance, to just disconnect those things and dissociate those things. I think one way to reconnect them is to really, again, remember that these interests are common. So if we study the biology of like a flow state or thriving or well-being and how it relates to performance, you can get better performances when you're well. And so people will say, but this person is an amazing athlete and they were abused. They could have been an even more amazing athlete. You don't know. Those hundreds and thousands of athletes who drop out of sport because of abuse, they could have contributed to the team's performance. So at the end of the day, if it has to be performance driven 100%, well, toss well-being in there, because that's part of it too. So in this type of culture where, again, I just can't even, I wrote down that number, 91, it's shocking. I mean, I went to schools that weren't necessarily prioritizing sports my entire life and come from a country where just doesn't have that kind of cash. So I really think if that's going to be the case, if we're in this environment, then go ahead and articulate the very clear connection between being well and whole and performing better, if that's what this is about. So that's one way to skirt around that problem within the current structure. Let's talk about the current structure. So we could consider siphoning some of that money off into other spaces. For example, student well-being or wellness clinics. One can imagine an integrative health center being funded by some of these profits. I mean, one could imagine how that structure could slowly start to change, but we can make do with both for the structure that we've got and the one hopefully that's coming down the pike. So that would be my suggestion for making it work with what we've got.
And to that end too, I really appreciate, if we're talking about culture, you have to know where they spend the money to know where the values are. And when I was working at the MSU sexual assault program, I was one of 4 staff, 3 were funded by a federal grant. So the university didn't pay for us, and then there was one other person and maybe it was $50,000, so you have $50,000 and 91 million, and I know they're different. I don't know what MSU's number was, but just if you're trying to create something in culture where something is prioritized, you have to spend money on it, like a lot of money, like $91 million.
And I was going to say, Austin, if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just to weigh in on the privacy aspect of the question that was asked. As a journalist, I come at it from a different perspective than somebody who would be within an institution. And obviously, in journalism, we're always advocating for more openness, more transparency. I also think it's incumbent on journalists to understand, the legitimate boundaries that are there, and that there are things that shouldn't be public. And I think any good journalist will respect that. I think, from my personal experience, I've filed many open records requests, and there are times that those have been denied for reasons that I felt like were totally legitimate. And there were other times that those were denied for reasons that I felt like maybe on the surface of it, it was presented as a privacy concern, but actually maybe it was more to protect the institution from something damaging being revealed. So I think in order to have that balance of privacy, which is very legitimate, we need to have a really clear distinction between things that should be kept private for protecting the interests of the survivor and things that should not be kept private just to protect the reputation of the institution.
And I have a question here that's directed towards you, Austin. I think everybody can speak to this, but the question concerns, is there something that fans and individuals can do to help prevent abuse? I think it's an interesting question asking from that point of view, but I'm not sure if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought about this as well, because those of us who cover sports, most of us were sports fans to begin with, and still have a little bit of that perspective at least. And I think one thing that's true about sports fans is, by nature as a fan, you identify with your institution. The things that come to mind when you think about your team, it's the logo, it's the fight song, it's the school colors, maybe it's the famous coach who coached at your school. All of those things that you associate with the institution, and great players too. I mean, everybody has their favorite players who played for their school, but often the fan's perspective, even subconsciously, will just align with the institutional perspective. And so if you have somebody, a former athlete who is speaking up about something that happened to them while they were at the institution, a lot of times the knee-jerk reaction, I think, of fans is to immediately defend the institution, because that's part of who you are. You're a sports fan. You love your school, you love your team, and that, understandably so. I think for fans, and it's a great question, being able to separate your love of the school and the institution from the way that you look at these situations, which are so different than anything that happens on the field of play. Being able to say, yeah, I support my team, I support my school, but I also support this person who represented my school and had an experience here and had a story that's really important to share. I'm going to listen to that person and not just instinctively, attack them even because it feels like an attack on your own identity. If somebody says something that could be damaging to your school, being able to sort of hold those two things together, your passion for your school, while also advocating for the players who attended your school, even if their experience there was not what anybody would want.
Let's see, I think we have a couple more questions here too. One anonymous person is asking whether if students at universities are asked periodically if they have been sexually abused. And they give the example like going to the doctor, we now answer questions concerning depression and trying to identify mental illness apart from patient self-reporting. So I guess on your end, if any of you are aware if that's a regular, periodical checkup that student athletes have, is being asked about sexual abuse.
That's a tough one. Sorry, Mark, were you going to answer?
No, I was just going to say, I from my perspective, specifically, no. Specifically, no, that I'm aware of. But I don't know if anyone else has input on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a tough one to answer, because the problem with asking about abuse is it in and of itself can be a traumatizing experience, as one can imagine. So if you ask somebody, have you ever been abused, directly, which is not the way one asks sensitive questions, but if you are to do that and they have been abused, but they themselves are not at a point in their journey that they have acknowledged, processed, and come to the other side of that grieving process, where they're able to just simply say yes. It's like opening Pandora's box silently, and they take that box fully open home. So that's the first thing. It could actually be re-traumatizing. So it's a challenging thing to just simply integrate into a clinical setting for that reason. But the second thing is, once you learn whatever information you learn, there's got to be very clear processes and procedures that you follow that are well known, algorithmic, and ultimately beneficial to the person sitting on the other side of the examining table or in the waiting room, whatever it is. You can't simply ask and just to know, or to use it in some sort of a company report. That's unethical and inhumane. So it's actually a very complicated question. So have we done it? No, not on a regular basis, because it's actually a huge ask. Here at Yale, there's a great movement. One of my collaborators, Yelena McLeod, is leading, where she's slowly integrating these questions in trauma-informed care into the pediatrics department, and then slowly but surely we'll move into sports medicine. But it's a process that you have to build the team and build the environment prior to simply dropping those questions into your daily clinical flow, if you want to be ethical about it.
And then moving in where we have 10 minutes left, I'll try to get through a couple more of these questions. one of them asks to all the panel, they're asking, does the NCAA, Pac-12, the University of Utah, or any other types of conferences or universities incentivize positive behavior? And I imagine by that they're meaning reporting, or I guess creating better environments for students to enter into these kind of conversations. But they're asking specifically, I guess, whether whether these kind of institutions give out any awards to coaches or to athletes for proactive or reactive healthy interventions or behaviors.
Well, to be snide, I think that all whistleblowers are still waiting for their award in the mail. I don't think that's rewarded to call out a system, to blow the whistle, to challenge stuff. And I think it would be great if that were part of it, because when people come forward, it's because they love the institution usually. And part of trauma-informed care, like Yetsa is saying, is community. You know, the communities have to be trauma-informed. The communities have to be safe. And so part of good behavior, and if, you know, measuring out maybe what that means tangibly, but it could also be, what's your policy on whistleblowers? You know, how do you protect people who come forward? How do you keep people safe? How do you, you know, talk about and reinforce a culture of safety and transparency so that people can, you know, like Yetsa was saying too, it's also just efficient, and it's more economic to have players who are healthy and mentally supported and emotionally supported. So if it's for bottom line or for compassion or for just being a good person doing the right thing, you know, creating systems and rewarding people and practices, institutionalized practices that reward people for, you know, getting help and talking about stuff that's difficult to talk about. And if there were celebrity, you know, former athletes or, you know, people, celebrities attached to universities, if they come forward and they talk about mental health and things that, you know, if we need some public images too, public figures who have credibility and esteem. And I know at MSU, if certain, you know, Tom Izzo has a lot of, you know, credibility with his name, and he has a powerful voice. And there's sometimes key players who can come forward, who encourage other people to come forward and change the conversation, change the dynamic about trauma, about abuse. And that alone would be huge if you have celebrities encouraging safety and honesty and transparency.
And then with the couple minutes that we have left, I'll just kind of go through on my end the screen who I see on the panel, asking this question to kind of wrap up. I'm wondering if you have any advice or things that you would suggest to those that are listening in today of things they can do to help renovate the current institution and systems on their end. Maybe starting with, I have Dr. Yetsa on screen first, if you don't mind beginning.
I don't mind it. I'm so excited about this question. I was waiting for you to ask it. I was looking at the chat. John Vaughn, he mentioned something about fans. He said fans both supported him and slandered him when he came forward about the harms he'd experienced in sport. And that just reminds me so much of the fact that sports has at its foundation this sort of yin-yang existence. And I've been thinking very carefully about how to frame, you know, where do we go from here, and what are we going to do about renovating this system? And I always go back to my African roots. So I always I want to bring a proverb to you guys. So Sankofa is a proverb that means go back to go forward. Okay, it means we have to reach back to our roots in order to positively progress forward. And if we go back to the roots of sport, they're just two things. And John Vaughn mentioned them in his opening remarks. There's love and there's nurture, and there's fear and there's aggression at the root of sport, this yin-yang foundation. Why do I say that? There's not one athlete I know, high performance especially, who can't say that sports is hands down one of the greatest loves of their entire life. And sports provides love. Teammates, coaches, fans, family, friends. So sport literally has at its foundation this great space of love and nurture and wonder. And it's a privilege to be part of that environment because many people don't have that kind of love in their lives. So me as an athlete, I'm grateful to it for that part of its foundation. But on the other side, there's also fear and aggression. Why do I say that? Because some people describe sport as controlled war, right? So it's sort of a space where a natural human impulse like aggression or fighting is actually expressed in a socially acceptable way. And so that's sublimation. It's a mature defense mechanism where you take a socially unacceptable human impulse and you channel it in some sort of acceptable way. And so that part of the foundation is what I think we've allowed to be run amok. And why do I say that? If you look at Dr. Nassar and Dr. Anderson, that's exactly what they were doing, sublimation. They were taking intolerable impulses, which were sexual in nature, and channeling them in acceptable social settings. For example, a sports medical evaluation and medical treatment. And so at the foundation of sport, this yin yang, love, aggression, nurture, fear, whatever you want to call it, we've allowed one side, I think, to just run amok and to bleed into many parts of our sports experience, in doctors' offices, in the media sometimes, in the boardroom. And I think that if we're going to go back and actually learn from the root, we should go to the other side and actually try to highlight the thing that we love about sports, right? The thing that actually makes it an increasingly wonderful place to be and live. And so I think the two best ways of doing that is just leave sublimation and all those defense mechanisms on the field. I don't think we should allow it to bleed into other parts of our sports environment. But then secondly, I think we should choose and value youth development over athletic performance, create sports spaces where athletes' concerns are not met with retaliatory punitive action, but are met with love and encouragement, as opposed to what we have now, which is suppression and that sort of negative side of sports foundations. So I really like the comment that John mentioned, because it really just highlights there are two faces to this thing. Sport at its root has both that love and that fear that he talked about during his keynote address. And we've allowed one to just run out of control. And I think that if we just focus on the other, we might get somewhere.
And Austin, I don't know if you had anything you were wanting to add, kind of in concluding remarks.
Yeah, I think my biggest advice would just be, don't be afraid of change. In sports, we love tradition, especially college sports. You know, tradition is so rich in college sports. And I know there are people every day in college sports who are forward thinking and who are thinking about these problems and how we can evolve to better deal with this stuff. But I also know sometimes the wheels turn pretty slowly, and sometimes there is a resistance to, well, this is the way we've always done it in college sports, and we don't want to do anything too drastic or too dramatic. And I think those of us who love college sports and want it to be around and want it to thrive in the future, I think we have to embrace change and realize that college sports 10, 20, 30 years from now may look a lot different than it does right now. And that might be a good thing. Some of the changes that can seem really scary, if it's a big departure from the way we've always done things, sometimes that might be the best thing in the long run. And I think we have to be open to those things.
Perfect. Thank you. And Mark, same question.
No, I just appreciate Yetsa's comments, and certainly Austin's as well, but some really good stuff. I'd hope to learn a lot, and I really have today. I appreciate it. No, I just think I would say this is a team sport, literally, when it comes to this issue. And what I've really learned, there's a lot of really incredible people on campus. I think athletic departments that have siloed themselves through the 70s and 80s and frankly 90s are learning that that's not a way to operate. And I've learned so much from my incredible colleagues in the medical field and in the psychological field and science and everything else, and just teaming with them to work together to manage this. And I think we've made steps forward, but gosh, we have so much further to go. So I guess I would say if the folks listening are part of the campus environment, I think, and I appreciate what Lauren said about Michigan State and different values. And you just hope to work at a place that is opposite of that, right? And I just, I've had a chance to read your story since we were introduced to each other and everything. It's hard. But I believe in this system of higher education. I believe in these campuses, and I believe there's things that we can do to really still lead the way as we manage through all of this. But I just want to say to the panelists, thank you. I learned a lot.
And then Lauren, no pressure, but if you have any final thoughts yourself.
60 seconds or less. I want to say, and again, appreciate the survivor advocates who've come forward and shared their story and the power of that. And if we can keep encouraging that, and then also recognize that people who are in positions of power who they're also the ones who need to make a lot of the changes too, that a lot of times it falls on survivor advocates to educate people and raise awareness, and it means digging into their own stuff all the time. And that can be really re-traumatizing. It can be really healing, but it can be re-traumatizing. So also people in positions of power who have the purse strings, need to be the ones leading the charge at the institutions to make the changes, who have the power to do so.
Well, thank you again. And again, I know I speak on behalf of our audience when I thank you for your time and willingness to engage in this discussion. And I know just from my end, having been a part of this conference, preparing, having this discussion with you has definitely re-smithed a lot of my own thoughts and even like kind of parts of my soul. It's been a really, I think, good experience to hear so many stories and different viewpoints on this. And so I thank you all again for joining us. And I thank the university for holding this, for the Sports Equity Lab for making this possible. And to conclude this conference today, I'll turn matters over to Dean Cronk-Warner to close with some remarks herself.
Thanks, Brooks. I really appreciate it. And wow, what a conference. I have to say, I received an email over the course of this, the conference that said the conference rocked. And I have to absolutely 100% agree with that. It was just such an amazing conference. I want to thank the Yale Sports Equity Lab for co-sponsoring this conference with us. I also want to give a special thanks to Professor Amos Guerrera, whose book, Armies of Enablers, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so, was really the inspiration for this conference. I want to really thank John Vaughn and Tiffany Thomas Lopez, who started off our conference with vulnerability and bravery and courage and their willingness to share their stories and giving power to the life of their stories. I also want to thank all of our panelists who talked about the ethical dimensions of this issue of student abuse, the legal issues, and especially this last panel that focused on the way forward. I took several takeaways that I found really empowering about this conference, that I really hope that one day we can see John Vaughn's vision come to fruition, a world where we don't need to have these types of conferences anymore. And I think that we've learned a lot today through the wonderful presentations of our panelists about how we can do that. We need to listen and we need to believe survivors and our student athletes. We need to center the humanity of our student athletes. We heard again and again stories of how athletes have felt that they lost their humanity through their association with various institutions. And so we need to center the humanity of our student athletes. I heard stories how we as individuals, those of us who are fans and who want to be supportive, I really liked the idea of emphasizing the love and nurture in sports. Sports has wonderful aspects to it, and that's why we are fans. And so let's lead with love and nurturing. Let's normalize discussions of mental health. Let's normalize talking about abuse and believing one another. And also, I thought Lauren on the last panel had a really good point about those of us who are not survivors and who are not experts in the field. Let's educate ourselves so that the burden always doesn't have to fall to survivors and to advocates, as I'm sure that is exhausting and re-traumatizing work in and of itself. As institutions, I heard a lot to build upon. We need to incentivize positive behavior. I think the last panel spoke about how the whistleblowers are still waiting for their trophies, that traditionally as institutions, we have not rewarded individuals who have worked to make our institutions better. We need to work on developing our environments. Athletic Director Harlan spoke about the desire here at the University of Utah to create better environments. And I think that's a message that we can take forward regardless of where we work, to work on environments that today, hopefully, normalize these conversations and listen and believe survivors. But in the future, we'll create systems where we no longer have student athlete survivors. We need to invest in dismantling problematic structures. I found really compelling when Lauren was talking on the last panel about how she came to this realization that the structure in existence was working for Michigan State. It didn't need to be dismantled because it was working as the institution wanted it. So let's really challenge that, and work to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. And let's work to build up those positive structures and invest not only human capital, but financial capital as well in those structures. So those just some of what I have learned throughout this conference today. Again, a big thank you to all of our presenters. An amazing day full of so much to learn and to bring forward. And I think we really can make a difference in this area. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you for attending and helping for this conference to be such a great challenge or great success in talking about a challenging issue. And we really appreciate your time. On behalf of the S.J. Quinney College of Law, thank you. And thank you for being engaged in this important work. I hope we can see forward John Vaughn's challenge and that we will build a world where we never have to host this conference again. Thank you so much.